surrounded by dense woods on one side and the endless ocean on the other. He lived there alone, tending to the light and recording daily logs. But there's one story he told me before he passed away. A story that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. It was late November, and a brutal storm was rolling in. The winds howled, and waves crashed against the rocks, sending icy spray high into the air. My uncle had secured the lighthouse for the night, and was sitting in the small living quarters, reading a book by the fire. The storm made the old building creak and groan, but he was used to that. At around midnight, he heard something strange, a rhythmic knocking sound coming from the front door. It wasn't the kind of noise the wind or rain could make. It was deliberate. He froze, listening intently. Who could be out there in a storm like this? The lighthouse was nearly impossible to reach on foot during good weather, let alone in a raging storm. The knocking continued, louder this time. Against his better judgment, he grabbed a flashlight and went to the door. He opened it cautiously, expecting maybe a lost fisherman or someone in need of help. But there was no one there. The wind whipped around him, and the rain lashed against his face, but the rocky path leading to the lighthouse was empty. He shone his flashlight into the darkness, scanning the area. Nothing. Feeling uneasy, he shut the door and locked it. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it must have been the wind playing tricks on him. But as he sat back down, the knocking started again. This time, it was coming from the back door, the one that led to the maintenance shed. His heart was racing now. He grabbed the flashlight and a heavy wrench just in case, and went to the back door. When he opened it, the same thing. Nothing but wind and rain. He shut the door and double-checked all the locks. But as he turned to head back to the living quarters, he heard another sound. A faint tapping, this time coming from upstairs, near the light room. The light room was the highest point of the lighthouse, accessible only by a narrow, spiraling staircase. He hadn't been up there since before the storm started. Gripping the wrench tightly, he climbed the stairs, each step echoing in the confined space. When he reached the top, the tapping stopped. The light was working fine, casting its beam out over the turbulent sea. But something felt off. He turned to descend the stairs when he noticed it. Wet footprints leading from the staircase to the far corner of the light room. He froze. The prints weren't his. They were smaller, like a child's, and they glistened in the light as if freshly made. His mind raced. Had someone snuck in while he was distracted? But how? He'd locked every door. Then he heard it, a soft, almost childlike giggle. It came from the corner where the footprints ended. He swung the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam revealed nothing, just an empty corner. The giggle echoed again, this time closer. It was behind him. He spun around, but again, nothing. The room was empty except for him and the steady hum of the light. Terrified, he bolted down the stairs, locking the light room behind him. He spent the rest of the night in the living quarters, clutching the wrench and waiting for dawn. When the storm finally subsided the next morning, he ventured outside to check the grounds. Near the base of the lighthouse, he found something that made his blood run cold. More footprints, small and bare, leading away from the lighthouse and disappearing into the sea. My uncle never figured out what happened that night. He stayed at Blackstone Point for another year, but said the lighthouse never felt the same after that. He would hear faint knocking now and then, or catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, but nothing as terrifying as that stormy night. To this day, the lighthouse at Blackstone Point is automated, its keeper's quarters long abandoned. Locals still tell stories of strange happenings near the old structure, and fishermen swear they've seen a small figure standing in the light room during storms. No one knows who or what it is, but one thing is certain. Blackstone Point is not a place you want to be alone after dark. Ravenwood Forest had always been an enigma in the small town of Harper's Hollow. Locals warned of an unshakable dread that settled over anyone who ventured too far into the dense woods, especially near the old abandoned ranger station at its heart. Stories of people vanishing without a trace, eerie whispers on windless nights, and shadowy figures darting between trees had become folklore. But for those who grew up in the town, these warnings were treated more like ghost stories than reality, until someone they knew disappeared. It was autumn when 3 high school friends, Ethan, Sarah, and Lucas, decided to explore the infamous forest. They were chasing a local legend about a shadow man who supposedly appeared near the ranger station after sunset. Armed with flashlights and their phones, they laughed nervously as they followed the narrow trail into the forest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the vibrant autumn colors seemed to drain from the woods, leaving behind a cold, lifeless gray. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees grew unnaturally close together, their gnarled branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. Strange carvings began to appear on the trunks, symbols none of them recognized, etched deep into the bark as if marking a path. "This is probably just some prank," Ethan muttered, but his voice betrayed his unease. The forest felt alive, watching them. After nearly an hour, they reached the ranger station. The once sturdy structure was now a rotting shell, its roof partially caved in, and the windows shattered. A heavy silence hung over the clearing, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. As they approached the building, Sarah stopped abruptly. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. The others froze, straining their ears. Faintly, from somewhere deep within the forest, came the sound of a child humming a haunting melody. Against their better judgment, they entered the ranger station. The air inside was damp and suffocating, and the floor was littered with broken furniture and debris. Lucas swept his flashlight across the room, revealing faded maps pinned to the walls, and an old rusted axe propped against the corner. But what caught their attention was a trail of muddy footprints leading deeper into the station. They were small, like those of a child, and they appeared fresh. The footprints led to a narrow staircase descending into a dark cellar. "This is a terrible idea," Sarah said, but Ethan had already started down. The air grew colder with each step, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over them. At the bottom, they found a small room, its walls covered in the same strange symbols they had seen on the trees. In the center of the room was a makeshift altar, with burnt-out candles and what looked like a doll, crudely carved from wood. Suddenly, their flashlights flickered, plunging them into darkness. Sarah let out a scream as a shadow moved across the room, darker than the surrounding blackness. The humming they had heard earlier grew louder, now echoing all around them. Panic set in as the shadow seemed to grow, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. "We need to leave," Lucas shouted, his voice trembling. They scrambled up the stairs, but the house seemed different now, distorted, with hallways that stretched endlessly and doors that appeared where none had been before. The shadow followed, its shape barely visible, but its presence suffocating. Ethan tripped, and for a moment, it felt as though the darkness was reaching for him. Sarah and Lucas pulled him to his feet, and the 3 of them ran blindly, bursting out of the station and into the forest. The forest was no longer silent. The trees groaned and creaked as if alive, and the humming followed them, growing louder with every step. They sprinted through the woods, the trail they had followed now unrecognizable. Just as they thought they would never escape, they broke through the tree line and collapsed onto the road, gasping for air. The humming stopped, and the oppressive feeling lifted, but the forest loomed behind them, dark and unyielding. They never spoke about what happened that night, but they all agreed on one thing. The shadow in Ravenwood Forest was real. Rumors about the forest only grew after their encounter, and locals began to report seeing shadowy figures lurking at its edge. The ranger station was later demolished, but the symbols carved into the trees remained, warning anyone who dared to venture too far. Some mysteries, they realized, are better left untouched. In the late 1980s, my uncle worked as a lighthouse keeper at Blackstone Point, a remote stretch of rocky coastline in Maine. He was a quiet, reserved man who loved the solitude that came with his job. The lighthouse was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense woods